So I've just finished The End of the Story by Lydia Davis, and I guess this is my review of it. So first of all, I want to introduce Lydia Davis, if you don't already know who she is. She's a very, I would say, the most well-known American flash fiction author. So she writes very, very short fiction, like less than a page long. You can, like poems, prose poems, I would say. And they're quite interesting. A lot of them are about gender. Um, I wish that I had read more of her flash fiction before I read this book because then I would be able to make a comparison between the two, which I think would be pretty interesting. But I didn't, and so I can't. So, what initially attracted me to this novel is an understanding about something sort of structural that it does that I'm quite interested in. It is a fragmentary, postmodern, sort of memoir adjacent book, and for reasons I'm not going to get into, I'm doing kind of a study on that type of micro genre. So I've read a couple of other books, fiction or otherwise, that are similar to the end of the story. And I think the end of the story is interesting because where those other books succeed, it just does not. It just does not succeed. So let me introduce the contents. And before I do that, I want to say I want to sort of misremember a quote from a writing book that I read. The writing book was From What You Dream by Robert Owen Butler, and what Butler said was that there are too many writers these days, too many novelists whose day job is teaching writing at a university. He said, and I assume he kind of had his tongue in his cheek for this because Robert himself teaches writing at a university, so keep that in mind. But he said, when you see a talented and unique writer end up with a job at a university, you know they have one more interesting novel in them, and then after that, they're going to move on to writing novels about like having an affair with a graduate student. The end of the story is about a professor who has an affair with a graduate student. And the thing that makes this slightly redeemable, the thing that makes this premise not something that I would be embarrassed to admit out loud, is that the genders are the opposite of what you would expect. So it's an older, respected, talented, accomplished woman dating a younger man. And I have to say, one of the few things that I actually like about this book is having like, I don't know, almost an audaciously cringe premise that it goes after. There's something in me that I don't know, just I just wanted to see what was in the book. Although I guess if Butler is to believe, these are like a dime a dozen. Also, of course, the style is interesting. It's not exactly linear, but it's not exactly non-linear either. It sort of bounces around. And yeah, I guess some of the nonlinearity comes from the author, or not the author, the narrator remembering uh, things that happened to her, and then remembering effects that that thing had later, and sort of reminiscing on it, and also questioning and undermining her own memory as she's going along. And this is pretty par for the course for this little micro genre that I'm studying. The other book that is kind of similar is The Angel, or maybe just Angel of Oblivion, by Maya Haderlap. And in contrast to the end of the story, Angel of Oblivion is a memoir. It's a straightforward memoir, whereas End of the Story is a novel. And okay, let's just get into the stuff that I didn't like about the end of the story. Let's just jump right into the bad stuff. Because what's interesting to me is that this type of novel is really compelling to me. This sort of these narrators that are locked in a web of reflection and they can't get out, um, those are really interesting. But this story, even though it does the same thing, it's really not good. So the first thing I have on my list is that the protagonist is a novelist. It's not automatically a sign that it's a horrible novel, but I kind of have to ding you for it. You know, it's equally annoying as to when like a movie in a movie there's a scene where they're like, "Oh my God, aren't movies amazing?" It's just annoying. I'm sorry, ding ding. This is your novel sins video. You're getting a ding. Um, and I have to say, it's not a situation where the protagonist is a novelist and then it just kind of doesn't come up again, or it is meant to tell you something about their personality. It comes up a lot. The end of the story is in part about the process of novelizing the events of the novel, which is very weird. It also reduces the distance between the narrator and Lydia Davis in a way that is, I guess, interesting as you're reading. Like, I couldn't help but wonder as I was reading the book how much of this is pulled directly from Lydia Davis's life, and I decided before making this video to not find out at all. So I have no idea. As far as I'm concerned, this is complete fiction. However, it is complete fiction that begs the question of whether or not it is complete fiction. So that's interesting. It's an interesting approach to make your reader think about whether or not you are the narrator. Interesting, but I wouldn't exactly say good. Okay, the next thing is that the narrator is way, way too reflective. The narrator just be thinking all the time. And normally this is something that I really like in these books, is the narrator just be thinking. But I think it's worth it to consider why in the end of the story all of this reflection is super annoying, whereas in the other books I've read, it's great. It's a big part of the sell. So first of all, the first comparison to Angel of Oblivion. Angel of Oblivion is a memoir, so listening to people reflect on their actual life is just going to be more interesting than listening to people reflect on like a fake life that they made up in their head. And second, the narrator of Angel of Oblivion is reminiscing on the memories they have of their grandmother and of that grandmother's memories of going through the Holocaust. So the base experience that we're reminiscing about and questioning and sort of examining in this way is inherently quite interesting. And it's tied in to these questions of historical memory that have a big, big significance. Whereas the narrator of the end of the story is reminiscing about an event that does not have that much inherent interest. And the inherent interest is maybe sort of more in the like nitty-gritty details rather than in the way that you remember it later. I don't know, it's just a topic. I think the topic of the novel is not well suited to this sort of reminiscing style, and yet that's nonetheless what we get. So the content being reminisced upon isn't interesting enough to bear the sheer amount of reminiscing that you're going to get. The other thing is Davis reminisces in a way that like moves you away from the sensory details that you want, which if this were a memoir or something, I would understand. I would not like that choice, but I would understand. Like, okay, we're remembering something that's maybe too painful. But because it's a novel and because I'm choosing to read it as not autobiographical at all, I don't like those choices. I think they are bad. Davis will say things like, then he said something that was so hurtful that I cried, but I don't remember what he said. And this is this is like you're not only not showing us, you're not even really telling us what happened. This is like this is instead of telling, we're being told about the telling. And it's horrible. The emotional distance between myself and the narrator is very high in those scenes, and not even in an interesting way that is sort of compounded. It's not the emotional distance isn't high in a way that is interesting or anything. It's just, okay, I'm not really there with the narrator right now. So okay, the other thing is I didn't mind this for the first like 70 pages or so of this novel, but it's very navel-gazy. Like, it just starts to feel a little narcissistic, and that kind of ties into the next thing, which is like, I don't know, I just kind of hate the narrator. And that's not always a problem, but over the course of the novel, I just increasingly didn't like her and wanted bad things to happen to her. And then the novel does not deliver. It doesn't, like, bad things don't happen to her. Sort of middling, like, unpleasant things happen to her, but they're mostly her fault anyway. And so as I'm reading this, I'm like, wow, it would be like, I want the trials and tribulations of this narrator to be increased like 3 or 4-fold over. And instead, what we're getting is like, okay, this isn't actually an episode from the book, but it's the type of thing that's in the book. Like, she sees a cat, and the cat makes her think of her now ex-boyfriend. And then we have to think about what the cat means. And then she's like, I don't remember if it was a white cat or a black cat. And it just gets very, very navel gazy very quickly. And if you're not super duper interested in what it's like to be a writer who writes a novel about this thing that happened, then it's just not the book just doesn't sustain that level of interest in the navel of our narrator. Okay, ironically, the last thing. Okay, yeah, actually, before we get into that, I want to talk about how the book doesn't really leave you with anything to think about. Like, originally, the stylistic like hallmark that I used to identify books that are in this sort of micro genre that I'm looking at was very, very short chapters. And the first book that I found that fit this was Sisters by Lily Tuck. Sisters is actually kind of similar to the end of the story, and I think it's maybe worth talking about why Sisters is successful, where the end of the story isn't. Because on paper, they should have kind of the same problems, right? So Sisters is also a novel that is also interested in a relationship between a man and a woman. In the case of Sisters, it's about an ultimately unsuccessful second marriage. There is infidelity. Ooh, spicy. Read the book. But the thing about Sisters is that the reason that this sort of navel gazing works in Sisters and it doesn't in the end of the story is that the navel gazing is much more, or not even navel gazing, but the reflection is much more indirect. And also the chapters are really short. The narrator of Sisters will have a whole chapter where they talk about some like Hungarian mathematician or something. And it's like, wow, that's crazy. And even if you're not into it, it's only like 500 words long. So it'll be over quickly. And then you, as the reader, are left to kind of ponder how that relates to the main story. It gives you something to go make a thinky face emoji about. And because Sisters also has these very short chapters, it's constantly, like at the end of every 500 words or so, the book is inviting you to stand up and walk away and go and think about what you've read. And at every one of those breaking points, there really is something for you to think about. The end of the story does something similar. It has quite short chapters, but there's rarely something that's worth standing up and thinking about. When I was reading Sisters, many times, I had the book in front of me, and then I just had to close it and just stare at the middle of distance and think about what I had read. I was never even a little bit tempted to do that with this book because everything is so straightforward. Like, she gives you the meaning of everything. There's nothing really worth pondering. And I think the strengths of this reflective memoir adjacent novel microgenre that I'm looking at is in causing you to reflect on what's happening and reflect on what is happening in the narrative. And similarly, Angel of Oblivion does something kind of similar. I wouldn't say that I needed to close the book to think about what I had just read as often, but there were passages that really stuck with me and really stayed as something that I have been turning around in my head ever since I read that novel. I am very confident that almost every detail of this book will be out of my brain by like next week. The only thing that I will remember is being frustrated with it. And this is doubly bewildering because of Lydia Davis's history as a writer. This is her first novel. I feel kind of bad about dunking on someone's first novel. Maybe someday it will happen. Maybe someday I will be lucky enough to have someone insult my first novel on YouTube. But yeah, it's a little bewildering that this experiment didn't work out for Davis because Davis is such an accomplished flash fiction writer, and her flash fiction is really good. And so a novel that is divided into these tiny, tiny chunks where she's reflecting on a narrative in sequence seems like a really good choice for Davis as a first novel. It seems like she would do that really well. And the issue is, I just feel that committing herself to a continuous narrative somehow, like the magic was lost. I don't know. It's hard to fully explain. Okay, now I want to get to the final bad thing. The final thing that I did not like. And it's a little ironic. The end of the story, she doesn't know when to end the story. For the last, like, being generous, like 50, being not so generous, 150 pages. I was like, why is this story not over yet? Why hasn't it finished? The story is about a relationship that falls apart. And like 2/3 of the way through the book, the relationship falls apart. And I'm like, okay, awesome. Time for a short and sweet, like 10 to 25 pages afterwards, after like explanation of how she felt, the effects that this had on her. And instead of that, we get like an entire novella worth of her reflecting on the things that have already happened and like doing kind of some crazy stuff, but honestly not in an interesting way. Like the things that this narrator does are wacko. Like some of them are like quite crazy, but they never cross the line into being crazy enough that I'm like actually interested, you know? She low key stalks this younger man, and you know, it happens in the part of the book where I had thoroughly given up on having a good time. So I was like, oh man, she's like stalking this guy. Maybe things are actually finally going to get interesting. And then they don't. Like the stalking doesn't like push far enough to make it interesting for me. Uh, yeah, yeah. So yeah, ironically, the end of the story does not know where to end the story. And just because you make this deficiency of your novel like a gimmick and you put it on the front of the book doesn't mean that it's not like annoying and horrible. Okay, I want to end by saying some things that I liked about the book. You know, have a little have some positivity right at the end here. So first of all, let's call out individual scenes or individual bits of the book that I really liked. So I think the craziest moment of the protagonist's stalking behavior is when she climbs up. So this is after the boyfriend has broken up with her. She climbs up the fire escape and looks through the window of this dude's apartment and sees him with his new girlfriend and just watches them. And they don't even do anything crazy, but just the scene of her watching these people that don't know she's watching, and them just like doing regular stuff, and then her thinking about the regular stuff that they're doing. It was a really compelling scene, and it made me jealous that I'm not reading like the alternate history version of this book that's actually good, because it proved to me that this concept is not a fundamentally flawed one, and that if this crazy protagonist's crazy behavior had just been like 30 to 40% more crazy, maybe it would have been a compelling book that I liked to read and not one that I begrudged every single day when I sat down to start reading. Okay, the last thing is that I just kind of love how messy it is. I mentioned that this is kind of a contradictory point because I mentioned that I really don't like the protagonist and that I also don't like any of the other characters either. There's not a single character in this book who I was like, oh, nice. They all sound like absolutely miserable people to be around, and the kinds of miserable people to be around that like don't reveal immediately how miserable they are, and so you end up like forming relationships with them, and then you have to like notice that they're miserable people and sort of try to distance yourself from them. That's like every character in this book is like that. And I really didn't like it, but I also loved it. If you know what I mean, you know what I mean. But I really hated it, but I also loved it. And I think the book kind of didn't really lean into the strengths that it has from having a cast of all miserable pricks. And it sort of leaned into the weaknesses, right? Because the story is about the reminiscence of these characters. And in order for those reminiscences, which like let's be honest, this is a really, really low stakes book. This is about a woman getting over a breakup, right? So in order for me to care about that, I sort of have to be on the same page with the protagonist. I have to care about them. And I don't. By the end of like page 50, I want this woman to get hit by a bus or something and not die. I want her to live and be in the hospital and I don't know, think about what it's like to be in the hospital or something. Um, but yeah, in order for those kinds of reminiscences to make sense, I have to be on board with her, or she has to be so evil that just being in her head is interesting in its own right. And she's not either of those things. She's not likable, but she's also not crazy enough that I find it interesting to be in her head. It's this perfect like Goldilocks zone of mediocre writing. And similarly, like the characters are really messy, but they're not messy. They're not messy in a way that it can hold the book together. The messiness of the characters is the one thing that I actually really do like. For instance, the character is like really worried about her boyfriend cheating on her, and I'm like, initially I was thinking like, oh, this shows that she's paranoid, and then it turns out like it's not that he was cheating on her, it's that the possibility of him cheating on her in exactly the way that she was worried about turns out to be a real possibility that he jumps on and uses as a way to like punish her. And that's some really compelling, like messy bitch shit right there. But it's not messy enough to like hold the novel together. And it's also, yeah, like it just doesn't go far enough for it to be like the thing that holds the novel together. It's just kind of interesting and not quite interesting to make up for the other deficiencies of the novel. But I do really like the way that these sort of amoral and like messy characters that I hate, I like them. I think that they could go in a work of art that would be very compelling as a result of how messy and amoral and like unlikable they are. But that work is not The End of the Story by Lydia Davis. So there we go. That's my review of The End of the Story by Lydia Davis. All right, I'm going to go now. Bye bye.